Imagine a scenario that flips the very foundation of Christianity totally on its head. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unpack a super provocative thought experiment from author Jim Palmer. It's this fascinating narrative that asks us to step outside centuries of tradition, and look at a familiar figure through a completely new lens.
So let's just dive right into this massive hypothetical scenario. What if Jesus' primary goal wasn't actually to establish his own exclusive divinity, but rather to model how humanity can awaken to divine love? Palmer's text explores this by imagining Jesus returning today. But, get this, not to judge the world or orchestrate some grand escape from Earth. Instead, he comes back to question the religious institutions built in his name, and to challenge us to awaken our shared humanity.
All right, part 1, the radical premise. The source material sets up this imaginary summit of modern religious leaders where the absolute central pillar of the Christian faith, the idea that Jesus is God, is suddenly put on trial by Jesus himself. The text imagines a prominent evangelical pastor greeting him with this traditional, foundational belief, "My Lord and my God," which, dating all the way back to the Apostle Thomas in the Bible, is basically the ultimate litmus test for Christian orthodoxy. It's the cornerstone of devotion that has defined who belongs in Christianity for literally 2 millennia. But then the text outlines the total shockwave of this premise, because the reimagined Jesus responds by claiming he never intended to be seen as the exclusive divine exception to humanity. He says, "I never said that I was God." He explains that his deep union with the divine wasn't meant to prove he was some completely different species of being. Actually, it was meant to show exactly what happens when a human life is radically, fully surrendered to love and compassion.
The core shift in this whole thought experiment is moving from a Jesus who is fundamentally biologically different from us, a supernatural being we can only really admire from afar, to a Jesus who reveals a relationship with God that is actively available to everyone. It changes him from a boundary wall that you have to cross into an open doorway you can just walk right through.
Moving on to section 2, rethinking the Trinity. The text argues that doctrines like the Trinity were constructed much later by theologians and then enforced by empires rather than being taught directly by Jesus himself. Because while early Christianity was incredibly diverse, it was vibrant, decentralized. But over time, there's this massive leap from a first-century wandering teacher to a 4th-century compulsory imperial creed, where specific theological formulas became very strict tests of faith. So the crucial point the thought experiment poses is this. Did enforcing these complex doctrines actually serve to protect spiritual truth? Or did it simply establish institutional control to define the insiders versus the outsiders? I mean, think about it. If you control the exact definition of God, you naturally control who has access to God. That brings us to section 3, worship versus following. Here we're looking at the daily, practical consequences of treating Jesus solely as God. The text suggests a pretty stark contrast. If Jesus is a supernatural being, well, we just worship him. And honestly, that's incredibly safe, right? You can do it comfortably from a pew. But if his courage, his mercy, and his radical love were fundamentally human, then we're actually called to imitate him. And imitation demands deep personal transformation. It demands sacrifice, which makes it much, much harder than simple adoration.
There's this really powerful moment in the narrative where the reimagined Jesus challenges a megachurch congregation. He points out that calling him Lord and singing emotional songs has often just become a really convenient substitute for doing the incredibly hard work of actually living like him. He says, "You have praised my forgiveness while preserving your hatred." Praising his divine forgiveness while continuing to harbor grudges, prejudice, and hatred against neighbors, it just highlights this profound disconnect. The source really elaborates on the psychological comfort of this divine exception. See, when Jesus is placed on an unreachable, exclusively divine pedestal, radical love and forgiveness get categorized as strictly supernatural, which basically creates a loophole. It excuses ordinary Christians from embodying these difficult traits themselves. It becomes way too easy to just shrug and say, well, I can't love my enemies, I'm just human. Only Jesus could do that because he was God.
Next up, section 4, the universal family. This framework highlights a massive, massive transition. It's moving from a fear-based religion where you have to earn God's acceptance through having the correct theology to the realization that all humans are already God's children. Belonging isn't some prize you win for having the right answers or holding the correct doctrine. It is the starting line of human existence. In Palmer's text, a child presents a simple, innocent drawing to a room full of theologians, and it just says, "We all belong to God." It's a beautiful contrast. You have these highly educated scholars totally tangled up in their complex exclusionary rules, completely disarmed by the profound simplicity of a child. It proposes that the family of God includes everyone, naturally dismantling centuries of exclusive doctrine designed to gatekeep divine love. Now, the thought experiment addresses a really natural counterargument here. If everyone is already God's child, why do we even need to repent? Well, knowing you belong to God doesn't magically erase the real-world consequences of causing harm. But think about your own life. We all know that changing a bad habit or offering a true apology is way easier when we know the person we hurt still loves us unconditionally, rather than if they're holding a metaphorical gun to our head. Knowing you're safe gives you the courage to face your flaws and change without fearing permanent abandonment. It's the profound difference between changing out of fear and changing out of love.
And finally, Section 5, Christianity without exclusivity.
The text envisions this massive outdoor gathering of diverse faiths, which forces church leaders to grapple with what actually remains of their religion if they surrender their claim to be the only path to salvation. It deepens the inquiry. If Christianity doesn't control exclusive access to God, what is it actually for? If the church isn't a toll booth to heaven, does it still have a purpose here on earth?
Palmer argues that what survives the collapse of all that exclusive doctrine are the core lived teachings of Jesus, beautifully stripped of the need to control, conquer, or condemn anyone else. Stuff like love, compassion, justice for the vulnerable, forgiveness. The institution essentially loses its power to frighten people into submission, but in the exact same process, it regains its authentic power to heal.
When asked about evangelism, the reimagined Jesus insists that missions have to shift entirely. He says love that requires surrender is negotiation. That is a profound statement. It means that conditional love is essentially just a transaction. True love isn't a bargain where acceptance is traded for theological agreement. So evangelism has to move away from religious conquest and forced conversion and move toward mutual dialogue and unconditional service. The source outlines these powerful steps for what it calls a purified witness. It's a deliberate shift from trying to bring God to the supposedly godless to discovering how God is actually already present in your neighbor. Christians are called to act as guests and learners rather than gatekeepers of the divine. You enter a community not to tell them God was absent until you showed up, but to recognize the truth and love already working right there. Ultimately, the text completely redefines Christianity's goal when that child's drawing from earlier gets updated with a unifying phrase, "to help us live like one family." Faith is no longer some evacuation plan for the afterlife. It becomes a roadmap for healing the present. The whole purpose is to help us live together, right here and right now. So, we'll wrap up this explainer with a really provocative question derived from the text. It leaves us to grapple with a fundamental choice about what truly matters. When push comes to shove, will you defend a religion, or will you love the human family?